a great professor out there, clinical professor of law at Cornell Law School. That's right. Author of Legal Insurrection blog, which is a great blog. Bill Jacobson. Bill, how are you, my friend?
Good. Great to be here. Thanks.
First of all, I want you to tell the public, because they may not know, what is the BDS movement and what does it stand for and who's involved in this?
Sure. Well, a lot of people think that means Bush derangement syndrome, but nowadays that means Boycott, Divest, and Sanction Movement. That's the BDS. What it is a worldwide movement to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel and Israel alone. What they've done is it actually started at the 2001 UN Durban conference, the conference that was so anti-Semitic that the U.S. walked out on it. That's where they came up with the idea that they would try to paint Israel as the new South Africa. They would try to call it an apartheid state, and they would try to implement the type of private universities, companies, etc., boycotts that took place against South Africa. So it was a deliberate plan hatched at a very anti-Semitic conference. The late Congressman Tom Lantos was there and wrote extensively about the horrible things that went on there. Now what happened is, within the next 2 to 3 years, various anti-Israel Palestinian and internationalist groups organized what they called a civil call for a boycott. And that came to fruition in a worldwide call to boycott Israel in 2005 from so-called Palestinian civil society. It's never been actually signed on to by the Palestinian Authority, but it's kind of this movement of the, Soros-funded type groups, EU-funded type groups, NGOs, non-government.
Whoa, let me stop. Soros-funded groups are involved in this?
That's right. That a lot of the groups that they're not necessarily directly, but that they get funding through these various left-wing organizations, which receive funding from Soros, which then pass it on, and eventually it trickles down to these sort of groups. So what happened is that for a few years, not a lot happened with it. They were organizing grassroots type of, so-called grassroots type of organizing. And then you began to see, mostly in Europe, calls to boycott Israeli products. And you saw disruptions of Israeli speakers. Even the Jerusalem Philharmonic Orchestra, the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra, was disrupted in Britain. And you saw this really begin to take hold in Britain, where they would go to academic groups, they would go to trade groups, they would go to other entities to try to get them to boycott Israel. And it's gained a fair amount of steam in Europe, particularly in Britain and in some of the other, the continental states. But it never really caught on in the U.S. Your listeners may have heard recently about Scarlett Johansson and SodaStream. SodaStream is one of the companies targeted by this movement. But it's never really gained a lot of traction in the U.S. because in the U.S. the population is overwhelmingly pro-Israel. It's more pro-Israel by every poll than it's ever been. But there's one place in the U.S. where that's not true, and that's on campuses. And much as has happened on campuses to turn, what I'll call either liberal or left-wing sort of causes that are much more active on campus than they are in the U.S., it's really an extreme on the campuses when it comes to this BDS movement. So what you have on campuses, you have things like Israel Apartheid Week, where various student groups build mock walls, they build mock checkpoints, all these other things to try to claim that Israel's an apartheid state, which of course it's not. It's a multiracial state. There may be religious conflicts, but it's not a racial conflict. And the latest iteration, and the thing that's occupied a lot of my time, because campuses are the only place where this gains a little bit of traction, where it has the most traction, though, is among some of the faculty members on campuses. And so what you've had in the last year, you've had 3 academic organizations, not universities, but professional organizations of academics, which have adopted the call for an academic boycott of Israel. There'd never before in the U.S., until last year, been any academic entity that had adopted a boycott of Israel. All the major academic entities refused to do it, such as the American Association of University Professors, etc., refused to engage in this boycott. But one group in particular, called the American Studies Association, which is about 4,000 members. It was the largest by far that had adopted it.
Let me slow down. 4,000 members, 4,000 faculty?
4,000. They could be grad students as well, but they're mostly faculty members at universities, and it's called the American Studies Association. What happened, and you know how this works, it's a matter of who shows up. So they were actually able to take over the key committees in the organization. They were able to take over the equivalent of the board of directors, and they proposed a resolution to the membership adopting this academic boycott of Israel. And what happened is most of the membership didn't bother to vote. It was an online vote. So of the 4,000 or so members, only about 1,200 even bothered to vote. And of the 1,200, 800, kind of the core anti-Israel group, voted for the boycott. And that was a big deal. It didn't receive a lot of mainstream press coverage, but within the academic community, this was a big deal because it was the first time that an academic organization had entered into the boycott of Israel. But when you look at who's behind it, this really is not what you and I might refer to as kind of mainstream liberal professors. This is really the extreme of the left wing, the people who view the United States as illegitimate because we occupy indigenous lands, who say that they would, if they were asked, they would boycott U.S. universities. We're really talking about the extreme here. But they were able to take over an organization, and they were able to get it passed because of extreme hostility to Israel. They talk about Israel being a colonial state. This is almost like Helen Thomas sort of material. If you remember Helen Thomas, the reporter who said, the Jews should get out of Israel and go back to Germany. It's kind of that sort of thing. It's really, really nasty stuff. And so that has really created this groundswell of concern about it. Now, the good news is that over 250 university presidents came out against it. All the major organizations came out against it. But they're pushing very, very hard on these things. That's among the faculty. There's also on the campuses various movements to try to get universities to divest from Israel, not just an academic boycott, but to divest from companies that invest in Israel.
So this would be a worldwide, if they had their way, economic war on Israel.
Exactly, and that's what they want. And that's exactly, you've really hit it. It would be a complete, it's called the economic, cultural, and academic boycott of Israel. They literally, they're objecting because the Rolling Stones are going to play in Israel. They object to conferences held by Israeli academics. They object to singers going there. They object to, even in Binghamton, New York, there was some Israeli musical group that was playing. They picketed outside that they shouldn't be allowed to play here. It is a complete attempt to isolate Israel, and the only place in the entire country, unlike Europe, where it's gained any traction is on the campuses.
But now, wait a minute, Professor Bill Jacobson, it's gained traction in our State Department, I think, too, because didn't John Kerry say several times, and even Obama said, look, Israel, you better step up with these negotiations with the Palestinians, or this boycott really may kick in.
That's right, and that was used as a hammer over Israel's head. Now, again, that's not so much a threat in the U.S., but it is a big threat in Europe, and Europe is a key trading partner of Israel. And so, yeah, John Kerry specifically used that to try to intimidate the Israelis into saying that, hey, that we're not going to protect you anymore from this. And when I say protect you, there has been an Arab League, the country's boycott of Israel, since 1945. Before Israel was even a country, they were boycotting Israel because they're boycotting Jews. That's the issue. And the U.S. passed boycott legislation in the 70s that pretty much shut down the Arab League boycott. But what the signal Kerry was sending was, hey, there's this civil boycott, this international BDS movement, and hey, Israel, maybe you shouldn't count on us to be able to protect you this time. And that upset a lot of people because, he was essentially giving, power to this BDS movement to try to use it as a pressure point, which a lot of people objected to.
But you made a point earlier that's very important. These are the same people, the same mindset, the same radicals who attack America, who attack the Tea Party, who attack what? Liberty-loving individuals.
And that's pretty much it. If you look at what they write, if you look at what the leaders write, they object to the U.S. just as much as they object to Israel. They claim that they would even boycott U.S. universities if there was a movement to do so. Of course, that's absurd. They work at U.S. universities. They get their paychecks from U.S. universities. They're not about to boycott themselves. But they realize the hypocrisy of what they're doing. But yes, these are not every single one of them, but certainly the leaders, the moving forces behind it, are very much kind of an anti-Western mentality. That the U.S. is essentially an illegitimate country because we're occupying Native American and indigenous lands. So yes, these are real. The motivating people behind this are absolutely the far fringe of academia.
Now, I only have a minute.
Sure.
Why is this not being more broadly reported, even in the conservative press?
I don't think that the conservative press views this as serious an issue as it is. They don't necessarily, they're obviously pro-Israel, but they don't view this as their fight, and I think that's a mistake, because these are the people who attend the Occupy Wall Street rallies. I mean, these are the people who seek to delegitimize the United States. It really is a common opponent. Generally speaking, the people who hate Israel tend to hate America. And, that's what I don't think the conservative movement has picked up on, and I really wish they would. And we're trying to take the fight to campuses. I mean, I've challenged 39 professors at Vassar to a debate, 39 professors who signed a pro-boycott letter. People have to get more active, and we have to call attention to these things.
Tell everybody you have a great blogging, great website. Tell everybody where they can find you.
Sure. The name of it is Legal Insurrection, one word, so it's legalinsurrection.com, or you can just Google my name, William Jacobson, and you'll find it pretty quickly. And, we cover a lot of political angles, a lot of law angles, and we've been focusing very heavily on this BDS movement for the past year.
And you do a great job across the board.
Thank
and
you.
I appreciate everything you do, Bill, and God bless you. Thanks for coming on. All right. He's terrific, Bill Jacobson. He really is. And he's a clinical professor of law at Cornell Law School. So he's really stepping out. And this is what he's done for many years. And he has this Legal Insurrection blog that is absolutely outstanding. So you'll want to check that out. But this has been going on now, this festering European, Arab, Palestinian, academia in this country, anti-Semitism, where they're trying to choke off Israel economically. And these are also the America haters, the conservative haters. You know who they are. They're the radical, disgusting left. So I wanted to put this on your radar screen.